Today we're going to look at the origins of the Jesuits, which are the most important spiritual movement to come out of the Counter-Reformation, and they both worked to solidify the expansion of European influence worldwide and to shore up the loss of adherence to Catholic Christianity that's taken place in response to the Protestant Reformation. So they're going into areas like the Americas and Asia, where European influence, the influence of Christianity, is starting to spread. But they're also going into areas back in Europe where Protestant Christianity has gained a foothold to try and reconvert people and bring people back to Catholic Christianity. What is interesting is that when we look at the history of the Jesuits, and this is kind of picking up on the big question about the Counter-Reformation that I raised last week, when we look at the origins of the Jesuits, we can see that this was a movement that was founded without a specific reference to Protestantism. There's an excellent argument to be made that the Jesuit order would have been founded whether or not the Protestant Reformation took place, whether or not Martin Luther was successful in establishing this break from the church. What the order would have looked like, of course, would probably have been a little bit different, and its early history would have played out differently. But it's important to recognize the ways in which the Counter-Reformation pre-existed the Protestant Reformation, the ways in which it's shaped by the Counter-Reformation. And so we're going to begin by talking about Ignatius of Loyola, who was the founder of the Jesuits. Ignatius was born in Spain, yet another Spaniard in an era that's dominated by Spaniards and Italians. He was the youngest of 12 children, and he lived a life of a courtier and a soldier. And as far as we can gather, there didn't seem to be a spiritual bone in his body. He was much more interested in looking good and establishing a reputation in the world than he was with pursuing Christianity in a serious way. In the year 1521, the same year in which Martin Luther was excommunicated at the Diet of Worms, he was fighting in a siege and his leg was shattered by a cannonball. It was, pre-modern medical treatments were not the greatest, and so the first surgeon that set his leg set it incorrectly, so it wasn't straight. And Ignatius ordered them to break the bone again and reset it. And they did this twice. Ignatius didn't do this because he needed the leg to be straight for it to function. He did it for reasons of vanity, that he wanted to look good. This is the type of person that Ignatius was at this time. However, he then had to spend 9 months in convalescence, and he had very little to read except for the Bible and the lives of Christ and the saints. And he has a conversion experience. In 1522, he exchanges his clothes with a beggar in the street as he's leaving the hospital, and he determines to dedicate his life to the service of Christ and the gospel. He spent most of the next year in an ascetic retreat, went up into the mountains in Spain, spent a year living in a cave, praying and fasting, and it was during this period that he developed his famous spiritual exercises, a system of meditations on the gospel and on the New Testament, designed to draw the soul closer to God. Now, the spiritual exercises were divided into these 4 parts: examination of sin and its consequences, the life of Christ, the death of Christ, and the resurrection of Christ. Now, Ignatius took very much a soldier's perspective to God's relationship with man. Spiritual exercises are the series of meditations designed to guide the individual to achieve greater self-discipline and therefore to be able to follow Christ more closely. So this was a process of daily self-examination that focused on a particular virtue or a particular vice, and trying to either pursue that virtue more consciously or to root out that particular weakness. Because Ignatius has this attitude of a soldier, he doesn't have any problem with the church being hierarchical. He sees that the individual must subordinate his will to the church, must subordinate his will to God. It is only by being able to control your will in this way that one can come to serve God and one can come close to God. And so this was a way in which Ignatius was very different from Luther. Whereas Luther rebelled against the hierarchy and authority of the church, Ignatius saw this as part of a natural command structure that he was used to from his service in the military. And so, so what we see here is an interesting combination of the Renaissance interest in the individual. The individual can master themselves, investigation of the heights of glory that an individual can achieve, but it's also aligned with a recognition that these individual achievements, the wills, the desires of the individual, they must be subjugated and subordinate to lawful authorities. And so here we see the Renaissance focus on the individual, but combined with a medieval acceptance of a church hierarchy. In the exercises, Ignatius enunciated three overarching principles. The judgment of individuals is typically inferior to the teachings of the church. Is inferior, not no typically about it, is inferior to the teachings of the church. Totally different from Martin Luther, who taught that an individual's belief in God could not be shaped and should not be shaped by the church. Churches should be decorated. Churches should be made to be beautiful, to attract the believer to God. This ran, and free will was emphasized by Ignatius. The individual had the ability to choose to master certain vices in order to save their souls. These last two principles run directly in opposition to John Calvin, who taught that decorating churches distracted the soul from the Word of God, that humans were predestined from before the origins of time, either to heaven or to hell. So we can see that even though Ignatius is not setting out directly in response to the Protestant Reformation, his philosophy, his spirituality that he's developing here is going to provide a very natural Catholic response to the challenges raised by the Protestant reformers. In 1524, Ignatius, somewhat idealistically, set out for Jerusalem. He wanted to go to the sites where Christ had suffered and died. He wanted to convert the Muslim rulers of Jerusalem at that time to Christianity. In the end, he narrowly escaped with his life and returned to Spain, where he found himself condemned by the Inquisition because he lacked the training to teach theology accurately. Again, here we see interesting parallels, but also interesting differences between Ignatius and Luther. Luther, also imprisoned by the Inquisition, rejected the Inquisition and escaped from the Inquisition. Ignatius accepted the discipline of the Inquisition. And so when he was released from prison by the Inquisition, he went to the University of Paris to study theology there. He spent 6 years undergoing formal education. And during this period, he developed a group of 6 companions, like-minded men, and these men would form the core, would form the original group of the first Jesuits. So they called themselves the Companions of Jesus, later the Society of Jesus, and this would be shortened simply to Jesuits. Jesuit formation was long and arduous. It would take 10 years, focus on trying to create those who have the discipline of themselves to be soldiers for Christ. Jesuits would take vows of poverty, chastity, and evangelization, both, and they would evangelize in 2 ways, through education and through missionary work. They also took another vow of obedience. Now, poverty, chastity, and obedience, kind of your typical vows that someone who is entering religious life at this time would make. This was in particular a vow of obedience to the Pope. And so this again indicated the way in which the Counter-Reformation encouraged Catholics to rally round and even increase the authority of the Pope during this period. What about the structure of the Jesuit order? Leader of the order was known as a general. They were elected for life and they nominated the other officers. Only those Jesuits who had completed this long period of formation of 10 years could vote for the new general. And so at the time of Ignatius' death, Ignatius, of course, was the first general. When he died and a new general was elected, only 3% of the Jesuits were able to vote in this election. So there's no interest in establishing a democracy here. There's very much an acceptance of a hierarchy. There's an acceptance of the idea that there's a military structure to this spiritual movement. You can see that in the use of the term general to refer to the leader of the Jesuits. And so this was the structure, the origins of this order.